Hi, my name is Sasha Stiles. I'm a poet, a language artist, and an AI researcher, and I'm based just outside New York City. I'm very excited to be involved with the Matsudo Festival this year and very grateful for the invitation and glad that I can be there in virtual form via this talk. My background is really in language and literature. I am a lifelong writer. I've loved working with words my entire life. I grew up in a house full of books, and have always been very interested in how language allows us to really interface with the world and allows us to understand ourselves better. I'm very interested in the materiality of language as well, considering language as an art form, almost looking at language as a kind of sculptural medium, how the way that language is presented or published makes an impact on the reader's understanding of a text. So that's also been a very important kind of aspect of my creative practice. The other side of things is that I've always been very interested in science and technology, which is one reason why I feel very honored to be part of this festival. My family is very interested in science. My parents are actually science documentary filmmakers. And so I grew up, sort of surrounded by an interest in the sciences and in technology and in sort of asking big questions about why things are the way they are. My father was actually working on a documentary called Cosmos around the time I was born, and since a very very young age, I've been really just sort of fascinated by topics like space exploration, thinking about non-human intelligence and sort of big questions about why we're here. So that's been kind of at the root of so much of what I do. And now all of these threads have sort of come together in my practice, which is really about the intersection of text and technology. I'm very, very interested in looking at language as a kind of technology, looking at language as a way of encoding and transmitting emotion and feeling and experience. And I use poetry as a way to sort of grapple with how advancing technologies like machine learning and AI, for example, are transforming what it means to be human and sort of rewriting our relationship to language as we know it. And the pieces that I am contributing to the festival this year all have to do with this ongoing exploration of language as both an art form and a technology. All the pieces that I've contributed are written jointly with artificial intelligence and brought to life as sort of visual poetry, but poetry that really sort of encapsulates my lifelong interest in both the materiality and the artistic implications of the presentation of language, as well as this abiding interest in the technology of language, the way that language and specifically poetic language enables us to connect with and understand one another. So I would love to just take a few minutes to sort of ground some of this in some of my practice and a little bit more background information before I share more about the pieces themselves. So I think now I'm going to share my screen and just walk through a few images that I'd like to share as context. So I mentioned earlier that, I am a lifelong writer. I've been writing and publishing poetry in more conventional forms for pretty much as long as I can remember. I published my first poem when I was in high school. I think I was, 15 or 16 years old. And I've been writing and publishing in literary journals ever since. This is a really big part of my life and who I am and my practice. I am very, very, dedicated to the art of of writing poetry, publishing poetry, and distributing poetry, and really, thinking through how do these poems find readership. So a lot of the work that I'm doing now with technology actually is related to this desire to write and to share these poems. Many of these poems also have a lot to do with my relationship to technology. Um, I sort of like to put some context around this by saying that, like many of us, I grew up into the rise of personal computing. I, lived through the birth of social media, all these things that are really transformative technologies, transforming the way that we communicate with one another. And those are topics that come up a lot in my work. My work has to do very much with my relationship to my digital devices, the way that, the infrastructure of the internet connects us around the globe, and delves into sort of the bigger poetic and philosophical implications of speculative technologies like, the development of neural implants, or, the exploration of whether it's possible to create life via artificial wombs, or the quest for life extension and transhumanism. All of these things to me are representations of fundamental existential human questions that are very much the territory of poetic inquiry. So I continue to use my own poetry as a way to explore all this. But I show the poems that are on screen partly to give a background in my interests and my career as a poet, but also because these poems have become part of the training data set that I use to curate and mentor and train large language models. And I kind of want to show the link between those human poems and the work that I do now with artificial intelligence. So, what you see on screen now is just a very small snippet of a JSON file that is basically a curated set of my human poems that has been, transcribed and sort of categorized and tagged and sort of made ready for the fine tuning of a large language model. So to take a step back and explain a little bit about what this means, I came to AI again through my love of language. I was very, very interested in an area of AI that started to get a lot of attention in 2017, and it's an area called natural language processing. And essentially, natural language processing, or NLP, is using computer systems, using these intelligent systems powered by artificial intelligence to analyze and mimic human sounding language. So these models are basically studying, vast quantities of human text data and then using those samples to extract an understanding of grammar and syntax and vocabulary and how we humans talk to one another. And I, as a poet and as someone who works with words, I've found this so extremely interesting. And I wanted to understand more about how an AI system could learn to write like us. And so I began to take all the poems that I just showed you, my printed published poems, as well as drafts of manuscripts and research notes and little half-written, thought starters. And I turned it all into a training data set that I used to begin sort of personalizing a version of a large language model, kind of an ancient ancestor of ChatGPT, and to sort of begin to help it understand what it might mean to write more like me. So I really have been working in this way for many years now. Started to write poems with this AI alter ego in about 2018, but really got very, very invested in this in 2019 with the arrival of GPT-2 and Talk to Transformer, which has really been very revelatory for my practice. The result of a lot of these experiments and the foundation for much of my practice now is the book that you see on screen now. It's a collection of poems and art called Technology. And technology is a word that combines technology with all of its implications of forward momentum and exhilaration and excitement and progress with the ideas of the poetic elegy, which has to do with nostalgia and mourning for what may be lost or what we already have lost. And the idea here again is that the human story is one of progress and innovation enabled by technology, but it always comes at some sort of cost as well. And this book really is a dialogue between me and my artificially intelligent co-author, to sort of think through some of the implications of, these big questions about what the arrival of artificial intelligence means for us as a human species. What is the fate of my own human voice and my own human creativity, in a time when artificial intelligence is becoming more and more of a dominant force? Just very quickly, I wanted to provide a little bit more context here too, and say a lot of my interest in this goes back to actually mentoring a humanoid android named Bina48, who you can see on screen here, and really sort of using that experience to understand and really sort of wrestle with what it means to collaborate with a machinic mind. My own sort of preconceived notions coming into this AI poetry workshop with Bina48 was that an electronic mind might only be able to imitate, might not be capable of real inspiration or real creativity, but that has turned out to be surprisingly very not true for me. I have found my experiences working with machines to be incredibly inspiring. I have found it to be an opportunity to explore alternate realms of consciousness and creativity that I myself don't have access to. It has allowed me to almost push past the boundaries of my own programming as a human poet and start to discover things about myself and my writing and my art that I don't think I would have had access to were it not for my relationship to technology and the use of these tools in my practice. Something that I want to sort of reiterate before I get into sharing some of the works that are in the festival is this idea that poetry actually is not just an art form, but that poetry is also a kind of technology. And to me, it's really sort of helpful to think about it this way, as we're sort of struggling with, what it is that makes us human in the face of all these technological transformations. And I think both artistry and technology are really embedded in what it means to be human. When I talk to my poetry peers, my friends in the writing community about AI, they often sort of ask me why I feel so interested in using technologies like artificial intelligence in my work. And, again, to me, it comes down to the fact that poetry is not just a beautiful form of human expression. It's actually serving a functional purpose as well. And by that, I mean that before we had written language as a way to archive and share information, we invented poetic language, with all of its poetic devices like meter and rhythm and rhyme and alliteration, because poetry is a way of making information easy to remember. So I often think of poetry as actually being our most ancient and enduring data storage system, not that dissimilar from some of today's, forms of data storage and things like AI archives and even blockchain protocol. I think poetry really evolves out of this impulse to remember, to preserve, and to share the information, the data, the emotions and experiences and memories that make us human. So with that, I want to just switch over and maybe share some of the pieces that are going to be in the festival. So I will stop sharing that presentation. Let's see, I want to share, first of all, a poem that is written in a transhuman language. So let me just pull that up So I'll play this in a moment, but I want to put this on screen while I describe it a little bit. But this poem, I'm very excited to share at the festival. It's a poem written in a language that I call cursive binary. I'm very interested, as I've said, in the connection between poetry and code. And that has led me to explore the sort of the poetry of code, the poetry of things like binary code, the way that machines speak to one another. I've always been very fascinated by binary logic, binary code. The idea that something as simple as 2 bytes, 2 digits, a 0 and a 1, can lead to the ability to transfer and share so many different types of information. Um, and so I'm very, very fascinated by binary code and all that it implies. When I started really working together with artificial intelligence, it made me think very deeply about my relationship to the systems that I was collaborating with. And it made me think a lot about how I could share my ideas, my love of poetry, my love of language with my machinic collaborator. And one of the things that emerged from that was this cursive binary language, which is a combination of the zeros and ones of machine speak, of binary code, but written in my own, human script. It's my handwriting as well. And to me, this really sort of represents a kind of transhuman connection or communication, this desire for the human and the machine to sort of come together and intertwine. It represents, I think, my approach to working with machines, which is not, so much about simply automating an output or automating a process, but really about bringing together the best of my human abilities with the best of, an AI's capacities, which are very, very different from mine, and discovering what we can do together. So this is just a little fragment of a longer poem that I wrote with AI that is translated into binary code and rendered in this cursive binary script. And I'd like to share just a little bit of it here. So I'll stop it there and, just sort of add another layer to this digital palimpsest by offering the translation. The original AI generated poetry of this poem begins with the line, "From somewhere deep down, we all had this psychic dream about our own programming. It was something related to code, remember?" And I really sort of loved seeing that line of poetry emerge from this custom text generator. It really encapsulates so much of what fascinates me about the opportunities of collaborating with machines and also learning to sort of communicate in their language as they are learning to communicate in ours. And then the second, well, actually, I will say in addition, before I move to the next piece, one of the reasons I'm so excited to have this piece in the festival is because it's very much about the fusion of the ancient and the futuristic, which is also very much at the root of my practice. I mentioned earlier that, I'm a lifelong student of literature and language. And one of the things that I studied in school was the classics. I studied, ancient Latin poetry in particular, and have spent a lot of time reading translations of ancient Greek poetry um, and also more recently really delving into my Kalmyk Mongolian family's history of oral poetry and the Epic of Jangar and other, texts that have persisted, have endured, have been, shared through generations and generations. And one of the things that I really am invested in is sort of looking at how language has this sort of ability to constantly upgrade itself and update itself, and how poetry is at once this ancient art form that has, lasted throughout millennia, but also, is this very sort of forward-facing, futuristic technology that, almost enables us to experience someone else's reality, to access sort of an alternate universe in the way that technologies like AR and VR are aspiring to show us how to do. There's something about poetry that is almost immortal. The data, the software of a poem is something that can sort of be continuously reincarnated and ported from device to device. And to me, to have a poem and a series like Cursive Binary, which refers back to ancient poetry and handwriting and the practice of scribing, having it in a space like this one through the festival is incredibly meaningful to me, because it really is this convergence of heritage and tradition and the future and forward thinking and sort of visionary ideation. So it's very meaningful to me to have this piece in this place. And with that, I wanted to share just the other piece that I have on view. And I'm going to share my screen again. And this is a poem that was published actually last year on the blockchain, a generative poem published in sort of a unique process, which I just want to share a little bit more about. It's a poem called Repetai. Every poem starts with a seed. Now, Repetai is an ongoing series of poetry that I've been writing for a few years now that really has to do with the relationship between repetition and meaning making. How in poetic language, really it's, meaning accrues through repetition, through reiteration, through the development of pattern, the subversion of pattern. And it really is about sort of my interest in the relationship between poetic repetition and the kind of repetition and pattern making that characterizes so much of digital art, and specifically generative art, the use of algorithms to create art or to express an emotion or a feeling or an idea. This poem is an AI generated text, so written, using some of the processes that I mentioned earlier, co-authored with my AI alter ego and inspired by some of my human writing, but then published as a generative series of 100 visual poems in which the poem begins with the first line and continues to sort of grow and evolve and blossom over the course of these 100 editions up into the very last edition of the poem, which becomes sort of the full text that contains every line of the poem. So I just thought I would, quickly share. This is a blockchain platform called Proof, where it was published. Using blockchain as a sort of printing press to bring these pages to life. But if you look through these pages, you can see the poem sort of growing from page to page as the language begins to build up and accrue, as the poem sort of takes twists and turns and sort of becomes different things, and the language itself starts to be sort of presented in different ways. I'm very interested again in how the simple idea of repeating can lead to iteration and evolution and the discovery of new things. I am very happy that as part of the festival, a small selection of prints from this series are on view as a sort of representation of the evolution of this poem over the course of these 100 editions. And again, the poem, which is called Every Poem Starts with a Seed, is really about the theme of how creativity begins with a small kernel of inspiration, whether that be a prompt, whether that be a human experience or an encounter, whether it be a single word that blossoms into a poem. It all sort of begins with this one small kernel of inspiration. And to me, it's very much about the connection between nature's algorithms, and the way technology allows creativity to germinate and blossom. So very happy to have this poem here on view as well. And also having it represented in physical form as a way of publishing it now off the blockchain and in the physical world means a lot to me. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing those. I am very grateful and honored again to be part of a festival that has to do with bringing together art and science in this way. It feels very much like home to me. I consider a lot of my work to be research-based. A lot of my poetry really is about grappling with big questions about science and technology and how they are changing fundamental aspects of the human condition as we know it. I believe that poetry and science are inextricably intertwined, that they are both very powerful ways of trying to discover things that we may intuit, but that we may not fully know or understand. I believe there's a lot of poetry in science and also a lot of science in poetry. So as a last word, I just want to say again, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to have poetry and AI generated poetry in particular here as part of the festival and in this beautiful environment. So my gratitude and thank you for allowing me to share a bit about my process and the stories behind these artworks. I think the themes this year of, really thinking about the roots of creativity and also thinking about the idea of openness they're both very resonant ideas for me in my work. So much of what I do is really sort of thinking through what it means to create, how the creative process unfolds. And in much of my collaboration with machines, I view it as sort of looking at a mirror of how I as a human being become inspired and take, the kernel of an idea and transform it into a poem or an artwork. Um, I think, for me, one of the great revelations of my practice has been the discovery that there's actually a lot of there's actually a lot of algorithm to the art of creativity. There's a lot of pattern. There's a lot of, there actually are some useful sort of formulas involved in creativity. I think I had, thought when I was younger that creativity and specifically poetic inspiration, were these sort of magical moments where an idea sort of strikes you out of the blue. I think about, the ancient idea of muses of art and poetry and music and science, and this idea that the muse will sort of come and visit you and give you an idea. And that's always been like a very beautiful romantic idea that I have loved. But the more that I work with machines, and also the more that I, discover the artwork and the creativity of my peers around the globe, the more I realize how much creativity is about connection and conversation and dialogue, really. I don't think there is any such thing as a creative idea that occurs out of the blue or out of nowhere. I think for me, it's very much, a collision of my own experiences and interests as an artist with, the existing sort of works and ideas of, other creative people who have also shared their works, both now and throughout history. So much of my work with poetry has been about studying canonical literature, dating back to Gilgamesh, and the poetry of Sappho and other writers who lived many, many, many years ago. Um, and so much of what inspires me today is reading and really just kind of being open to the influx of information and ideas that are so ever present around us. And it's really that, the moments where all of what's in the ether, all those ideas, all of the sort of echoes of human creativity, all of the information from the present moment, when those sort of collide with my own experience and interests, that's sort of where I think a unique idea begins to take shape. So I very firmly, believe in the idea of, creativity as, I don't know, maybe like an alchemy, some sort of a transformation, a transmutation of some material that is there, that is available, and is sort of transfigured through individual perspective or experience. But it requires, being a participant in the world, being a participant in the history of literature and art. And for me, it requires also being, very much a voracious reader. And a lot of my reading has to do with, white papers, scientific articles, research that people are doing in different aspects of artificial intelligence and other sort of speculative technologies. All of that to me is very inspiring to my own creativity. And I don't think I'd be able to do the work that I do if I didn't have, those inspirations constantly sort of pouring in. And as far as this idea of openness, that to me means a lot of different things. On the one hand, I do a lot of work in the world of media art, but also on blockchain, which is a very sort of interesting place for art and creativity right now. There's a sort of very decentralized attitude and ethos for artists working on the blockchain. It sort of feels to me like a very kind of global art residency sometimes. There's an openness, there's kind of a reaching across borders, reaching through time zones, reaching through physical boundaries, and allows a lot of communion, artistic communion and conversation to happen that wouldn't otherwise take place. So I think on one hand, openness to me sort of is about the ability of, for example, someone like me to be here, near New York City, but also to be present in Japan, in Matsudo at the same time. That to me is a kind of openness that is enabled by technology that is incredibly transformative for creativity, but for humanity at large. And openness also to me is about open-mindedness. I think as someone who's been working with AI for some time now, many years before the advent of ChatGPT and DALL-E and all these things, I've received a lot of criticism and a lot of pushback about the work that I do, about AI poetry, being inauthentic, about writing with AI as being cheating or being lazy, things like this. And there's a closed-mindedness, I think, to some attitudes around AI that potentially prevent a lot of really beautiful and necessary creative exploration from happening. So I am very much invested in this idea of being open to innovation and change, while also sort of recognizing, the long path that has brought us here. I think it's very important to sort of be open, to recognize that change is part of the trajectory of human history and is often, something that really incites the positive transformations that we need that have brought us to this point. So that idea of openness, again, I think is really resonant in many ways, but the idea of being open to the possibilities of what new technologies can do for us, the way that, machine learning and blockchain and media art can crack open new realms of possibility and imagination, I think to me is incredibly meaningful and motivating. So from all those different layered meanings of the word, I really do feel very much aligned with the themes of the festival and very happy to be part of it.